Hello, everyone. I'm Doshon Farad. Welcome to Your Black Worlds podcast. Today we have a very special and distinguished guest, brilliant scholar, intellectual, and author, Dr. Tyrene Wright. She is a professor at the City University of New York. She recently wrote an excellent book titled Booker T. Washington and Africa, The Making of a Pan-Africanist. It's discussing Mr. Washington's clandestine role in Africa and African affairs. She is a producer and host of WBAI's Where We Live. But getting back to Mr. Washington, as we said, his clandestine role in Africa and African affairs, over the decades, there have been many misconceptions about Mr. Washington among Black people, among African Americans. So Dr. Wright is going to clarify some of these misconceptions about our brother. Welcome, Dr. Wright. How are you?
Thank you for having me, Brother Doshon. It's my pleasure.
Okay, well, Dr. Wright, we're going to get right into it. Why did you write this book about Mr. Washington? What compelled you to do this? And I see that you're a Tuskegee University grad.
Yes, I'm a Tuskegee alumni. However, that is not the reason I wrote the book. It's so funny because I know you have a copy of the book and have read it, and people have said to me, we didn't have any sense of the fact that you were an alumni, and no, you wouldn't, because I don't take that position as an alumni in the book. You know, it really had very little to do with me writing the book, but as a scholar, years ago, I actually encountered Washington's activity in Africa as a result of Manning Marable writing an article titled Booker T. Washington and African Nationalism. And that article in and of itself sparked my interest in digging into Washington's, life, relations, and projects, and eventually what I uncover policy cases in Africa and in the African world. So obviously I was a history major as an undergraduate student at Tuskegee. However, that wasn't enough to make me write this book, right? The information that I found in that article in particular was corroborated by an article that Lewis Harlan had written about Washington called Booker T. Washington and the White Man's Burden, where he also delineated Washington's role and interactions with various African nationalists and in various situations. So they sent me on this journey to uncover pretty much Washington's real interactions. And so I basically pretty much lift from Washington's personal papers all his activity related to Africa, African nationalists, and the African world as a whole. And from doing that, looking at these salient cases and correspondence, because just so you know, the Booker T. Washington papers consist of 15 volumes.
My goodness.
Each about 300 to 500 pages. And they're all correspondence to and from Washington and various people throughout the world.
Dr. Wright, if I may, this reminds me, we oftentimes speak about the massive volume of Du Bois's papers.
Right.
But we very rarely hear about Washington's papers. But please continue.
Yes, so Washington's personal papers is a massive collection, and it was edited by none other than Lewis Harlan, who is a white historian, was a white historian. He's since passed away. And he had a monopoly on Washington's role in, he had a monopoly on editing Washington's personal papers as given to him by the Library of Congress, right? Now, in, looking at these cases and the direct correspondence, I'm able to recreate, many situations, cases, correspondence, relationships and then I examine those relationships. Now, what made me really write the book is the fact that I found that Washington's role in Africa was unparalleled by any African person born here in the United States. And so I, do the work that a historian does in terms of his interpretation of the historical facts, and also deliver some criticism of previous historians who examine what I had the opportunity to examine and had access to what I had access to, but still came to other conclusions.
So
both Manning Marable and Harlan dismissed Washington's role in Africa.
So now, when you say unparalleled, you're saying his work in Africa was even more prolific, say, than that of, say, of a Malcolm X, of a Paul Robeson, and other American-born black nationalists?
Oh, absolutely, because he did things. His engagement with African people, the African continent, and the policies that impact African people and the African continent, they are measurable. What he did is measurable. So, just to give you a blip of some of the things, the book gives you a lot of information about how he develops the ideation to even engage Africa in this way. But the crux of it all, or what is produced in the end, are two policy cases that I present that Washington is involved in. And one is the Liberian Crisis, where he negotiates on behalf of Liberia to preserve it as one of two only independent African nations on the continent at the time. And the second is the African exclusion measure, where he challenges U.S. policy to lock out the African population worldwide, but with focus on the African population in the Caribbean, Central, and South America. So, yes, those two concrete cases we can weigh and measure what he did, because he made such a change and difference in what would happen afterwards, meaning the Liberian Crisis was completely about preserving Liberia, that was under the threat of being annexed by French, British, and German imperialist forces on the ground in West Africa. Washington is the key negotiator in that case, and it is a test of endurance, because that case spans from 1907-08 to 1912, and he stays with it, and he does all kinds of negotiations in order to bring that full circle in favor of the preservation of Liberia. And not only that, he is very coherent and mindful of our specific position as African people who have expatriated or been resettled in Liberia as so-called Americo-Liberians. He's aware of the issues and the contradictions around our posture there. So he's not in the anti-African posture some may assume he would be in that case, meaning we understand that the Liberian Crisis, that the Liberia presents this issue where so-called Americo-Liberians and indigenous African Liberians who had never been displaced or removed are actually clashing. This is documented in his papers and in my case and in my account in the book. It's well documented that there were violent clashes between the Americo-Liberian population and the indigenous African population, and Washington does not take the position that the Americo-Liberian population is inherently right, just because he comes from, is an African born in the American context. He recognizes the contradiction in the posture, and he says that this is an issue and a conflict that must be resolved in order to preserve the nation. But he really is a mover and shaker on the U.S. policy end, negotiating to the point of securing Liberia and buying them out of debt, which was, what the demands were from those imperialist forces on the continent. But in the African exclusion measure, a very different kind of case, which I consider these two cases like the fruits of his development, of his, consciousness, meaning that's why the book is called The Making of a Pan-Africanist. It's about his transformation, because he's not always this way, right?
Yes.
But there is a transformation. There's relationships and interactions that prepare him for these struggles in the end. And so in the last and final case, you have Washington challenging the U.S. government and its politicians in their attempt to legally lock out via legislation any African person from anywhere in the world coming to the U.S. from 1915 on, and put them in the same category as criminals and undesirables attempting to enter the country.
So Dr. Wright, he was involved in this Pan-Africanistic activity while he was being considered an Uncle Tom by many in our community?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes. He's got his hands very involved in Africa simultaneously while being called an Uncle Tom and so on and so forth. Yes, absolutely. But, I think, what has happened with Washington and larger American society is a direct result of who was allowed to define Washington and his legacy, and that was Lewis Harlan, right? Mm-hmm. And Lewis Harlan was his primary biographer. He also edited the 15 volumes of the Booker T. Washington papers,
yes,
personal papers, and he wrote numerous articles on Washington. But he openly said that he did not like Washington, that in editing his personal papers, he didn't come to like him, but he realized that he was just a sneaky, underhanded man. So in other words, he's not an Uncle Tom per se, but he's a sneaky, underhanded man. So this is the person who has been allowed to define. This is the person that we allow to define. Right? In our community, we allowed this individual to define Washington to us. So most of what you know about Washington was funneled through Lewis Harlan.
Now, why did he dislike him?
Well, Lewis Harlan was a white liberal scholar, and by that time he comes out of a line of scholars that follow the Du Boisian tradition. Mm-hmm. And I talk about this, in the preface of my book.
Yes.
About this very issue as to why Harlan had to take on Washington that he did. But he was a golden boy. He got great funding, and so he ends up editing Washington's papers. But, Harlan was not committed to the project of, editing Washington's personal papers, so there's numerous errors and factual errors, some notes that are not really correct in their interpretation of the facts that are represented in the letters in his personal papers. And he also is somebody so disconnected from who and what Washington was, right? Washington was a man born in enslavement in this country.
Yes.
Lewis Harlan is a white male, probably born during the Depression era, goes through, he may have participated in World War II and ends up having the opportunity to be a scholar and is pretty much an academician for much of his life. So he he had a monopoly that we did not interrupt in our community because we took their word for it.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Manning Marable had an opportunity to interrupt this monopoly, and he was best positioned to do so. But by the time he is exposed to Washington's papers, he's actually probably he's Manning Marable actually is the professor at Tuskegee. During the 70s, and his family is entrenched in the Tuskegee community, and he was a professor in the history department. He had access to Washington's personal papers and otherwise, and he would have known everything I know and more, possibly, and which led him to write the article, Booker T. Washington and African Nationalism. Right?
Yes.
Which is a profound title in and of itself. He, cites this laundry list of all of Washington's relations, but conclusively says that it means nothing.
Now
it's in terms of Washington's political position of consciousness and all that. He said, no, he's still pretty much an American Negro. And that was inaccurate. I think it takes courage to even deal with Washington.
Dr. Wright, it's ironic that you said that because you actually have a lot of black scholars in Manning Marable's circle who have had that accusation, including Marable, thrown at them.
Mm-hmm.
People said that about Dr. Marable, and not just after he had wrote the book concerning Malcolm's concerning accusations against Brother Malcolm,
right.
but people I remember coming up, people would say that about Dr. Marable and other people like that. Well, even though you're coming across as being progressive, you're just a Negro, American Negro. So I see the irony.
Right. Oh yes, a lot of irony. But that's where I take pleasure in doing the work. I mean, I think Washington is probably the most well-known figure that I'm able to do this work for or about. But I mean, this in terms of revisiting historical data and really pretty much working to uncover historical facts that shift how people look at a particular period or time or person even. I think is, that's part of my occupation. And I think that, it's something that I think believing is that it should be done is a safety measure for all of us. You get what I'm saying? So now you're right. Manning Marable is no longer with us. And who will defend him? Who will correct the record with regard to him, right? And that has everything to do with, us functioning from a particular perspective as African people in doing this work, meaning knowing that whoever our leadership, whoever they were, whoever they are, that we will be the ones to weigh and measure them, right? And I say that we will be the ones to go back and interrupt any monopolies of their legacy. We will define them and how they served us, right? We will do that. What others say about them is irrelevant. You understand? And of course, in doing that, we have to be brave enough to condemn or praise them in relationship to their service.
Now you mentioned earlier Du Bois. You mentioned scholars being trained in the Du Boisian tradition. If you would, can you please describe briefly, and you speak about this in your book, but for those who haven't read your book, give them a snapshot, if you would, of the relationship between Washington and Du Bois.
Right. Oh, between Washington and Du Bois.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Oh, I love that. So, of course, I'll take that half and half, I'll break that into two parts. One, what I was referring to in terms of the Du Boisian tradition is that, Harlan came out of a line of scholars who were part of the Du Boisian tradition, meaning Van Woodward, Du Bois, and Van Woodward, and then Van Woodward's student, Lewis Harlan. So he comes out of a certain school of thought in terms of their position. Du Bois was able to sort of institutionalize his position on Washington, and that's unique, right? And so then his students eventually right there at the point of delivery in terms of interpreting Washington and his legacy. So that's one piece of it. Now, what I deal with in the book is, the relationship between Du Bois and Washington. And I'm actually rewriting a larger version of this book, but it's interesting because what people generally know about their relationship is just the latter part of their relationship. They had a very positive relationship for about 9 years, the first 9 years, and I discussed this relationship based on Washington's personal papers and correspondence directly with Du Bois, no secondary sources involved. I explore this relationship directly from Washington's personal papers, and they actually have a mentor-mentee relationship for that first 9 years, and a favorable one. Du Bois is the one to initiate the relationship with Washington, having Washington's third wife, Margaret Murray Washington, in common. And as a result of completing his PhD, he writes Washington for a job, and that relationship is initiated in 1894. And from that point on, they have a positive relationship. The fallout comes in 1903. And Du Bois writes about this. He corroborates what's in the Washington papers about their personal interactions. But the fallout between them, after having many interactions, after both of them were involved in the plenary sessions of the first Pan-African Conference, Du Bois spends makes numerous trips and visits to Tuskegee. There's one little blip that I want to, cite for you in this conversation about that. But, Washington is the person who appoints Du Bois and Calloway to the Paris exhibit, okay? Because that's on a part of the U.S. government, actually, featuring the black middle class, the colonized Negro in America called the Afro-American. That was part of the U.S. government's initiative in relationship to colonial Africa. So Washington is the person who points him to that. But they are in a positive relationship until, not the book, but until the summer of 1903, where Du Bois spends most of his summer, early part of the summer, in Tuskegee with Washington and his family, and then goes to Boston and congratulates Monroe Charter on the Boston riots and his handling of the riots after the fact. Now, Charter was not involved in the riot. However, he was leadership in Boston, and he did pretty much chime in on, the riots. Washington took offense to this because, as you know, Monroe Charter was one of his chief critics, publisher himself of a paper where he consistently criticized Washington, and someone Washington considered an enemy. Du Bois went and coalesced with him, and Washington took offense to that after having him in his home, having this relationship with him as a mentee, having, worked with him, coalesced with him, and brought him into his, family and home. But he was not through with Du Bois, right? Washington is a well-developed individual at that point in time, and so he's not through with Du Bois, but he's offended, okay? After that, though, Du Bois always seemed to have a seething issue with Washington. He was always quietly seething, it seemed, in terms of his relationship, a generational issue, no doubt, meaning, a young man elder man kind of issue, but because they're not, they're not cohorts. They're contemporaries, right? They're living during the same time, but they're not cohorts. Washington is significantly older than Du Bois.
Oh yeah, similar.
Right.
It reminds me. I'm gonna let you finish, Doc. It reminds me of the schism between Du Bois and Garvey, because Du Bois being 18 years, I believe, older than Garvey.
Right.
And
Absolutely.
similar, but go ahead.
Yes, and much of what Garvey inherits is as a result of Du Bois' conflict with Washington, because it's Du Bois who is more emotionally hurt or emotionally touched by their relationship. But his was an issue with Washington views, and I admit in the book, and I discuss it as such, his abuse of the Tuskegee machine, right, which was a secret network of lieutenants, power brokers in this country who did his bidding below ground for the most part, and sometimes above, but certainly were movers and shakers for Washington and would silence anyone in the black community who opposed Washington's position on, certain things. And Du Bois had an issue with this because he probably witnessed, but at least noted that Washington actively silenced the voices of young black intellectuals and otherwise who did not readily agree with him.
Wow. So who would have known that you're telling us that Washington had some gangster in him? It sounds to me.
Oh, absolutely. Yes, I think that's for certain. I mean, now then there are certain level of knowledge that I have that comes from being a Tuskegee alumni, right, and being in Tuskegee and being able to not just revisit the period but revisit the place. And so, yes, how he ran the town was very much like that to a large extent. His impact on the town was like that. And so it's not, for Tuskegeans, it's no surprise to see Du Bois have an issue with how Washington did things, because Washington can be compared to many things in terms of how he ran not only Tuskegee, but how he maneuvered.
I'm listening to you. I'm listening to you. Said how he ran the town, but go ahead. You said how he maneuvered in America.
Yes.
You said how he maneuvered in America. But
yes, how he ran Tuskegee, and there's an inside conversation, there's an outside conversation. So I'm being gentle in saying that, but how he ran Tuskegee, absolutely, and how he maneuvered in larger American society, he was very often compared to organized type of enterprises. Although Tuskegee was always very legitimate, in nature. So, but Du Bois, this is a chief issue for Du Bois, the silencing of his generation that opposed Washington. And the magnitude of Washington's power. Part of, being a historian and author of this book is just, I wanted to be very honest about, I didn't want to give an imbalanced interpretation of the facts. That's part of the reason why I acknowledge that, Washington didn't only use the Tuskegee machine. He, when necessary, for his benefit or for our collective benefit as he perceived it to be, would abuse it as well. And you see that even in the final case, the African exclusion measure, he's not above saying pull every string possible to achieve this end, right? And so you can imagine that he's done that many times and in many instances. But in these instances, in the final cases of the book, they are things that will benefit us and our survival and our well-being in this world. So that was Du Bois' issue with Washington, and he writes about it, Du Bois, in his in an essay that he would later publish called "My Personal Relations with Booker T. Washington and Others," and he discussed how in The Souls of Black Folks he very consciously chose not to discuss his personal grievance with Washington, but his programmatic dispute. Now, that's the second half of the Du Bois-Washington commentary, because there was no programmatic difference between the two. So that was a fallacy, and Du Bois understood that. Now, how do we know that? We know that because Du Bois, like I said, is in Tuskegee. We can put him in Tuskegee on many occasions. I mean, really, to be honest, the only thing that stops me from saying that he taught at Tuskegee in the summer of 1903 is the fact that I've never been able to identify or locate the syllabus. But we know that he's there, and he's actually discussing in depth, even a year before he goes to University of Pennsylvania, what he feels like he could do at Tuskegee. Now, why do you feel like you could do anything at a vocational industrial school when you are a scholar, a social scientist? Or he knows that Tuskegee is not a vocational industrial school. It has never been simply a vocational and industrial school. It has always been a school for teachers that also taught the industries. Right?
Understood.
And Du Bois knew this. Tuskegee always taught subjects like history and pedagogy from its inception. And certainly when Washington makes some changes and the institution receives its new charter in 1893, when he makes the institution independent of the state of Alabama, that's reaffirmed that this is an institution for teachers who could teach the academics and then also teach mastery of in the industry, right, and vocation. So, but there's a little point I wanted to highlight. So, for example, the second letter in the book written by Du Bois to Washington.
Yes.
In the chapter 2, which I call Booker T. Washington, Pan-Africanist and Pan-Africanism, because Washington can be placed in the history of budding Pan-Africanism at the turn of the century, right, 1900. But Du Bois writes this brief letter to Washington. He says, Dear Mr. Washington, I feel that I should like to work at Tuskegee if I could be of service to you. This is his words, direct words. My idea has been that there might gradually be developed there a school of Negro history and social investigation, which might serve to help place more and more the Negro problem on a basis of sober fact. I think that in time, various colleges like Harvard, Chicago, Johns Hopkins, and the UPenn would join in supporting such a movement. What do you think? At the present, I know just how I could be of service. I can teach most primary and secondary branches, preferring, of course, history, economics, social problems. I have had an indication that I may possibly expect an offer from the University of Pennsylvania for a year, after which, if needed, I could come to Tuskegee, perhaps have the active aid of a great college like University of Pennsylvania. In any case, I am willing and eager to entertain any proposition for giving my services to your school. So that's one of many occasions where Du Bois and Washington engage in this conversation around Du Bois teaching and contributing and building at Tuskegee. And clearly in that particular letter, he is eager to, study the Negro and the Negro problem and issues related to it on a more scientific level, right?
Yes.
So you see his mindset that he is, ready. He's preparing to conduct the first, scientific study of the African person here in this country, and goes off to University of Pennsylvania and actually conducts that study, right?
Yes.
The study of the Negro. But he is always aware that Tuskegee was more than, as you can see, he says history, and other social sciences, right? That he is prepared to teach, economics, so on and so forth. History is irrelevant to a vocational worker, an industrial worker. Do you know what I'm saying?
Right.
They should know it, but it's irrelevant. So you're not pitching that to someone who is running an industrial and vocational institution. You're pitching that to someone who is teaching the academics, right? And so we know that statistically Tuskegee always produced more college-educated blacks, teachers to be exact, than anything else, more than industrial laborers and vocational workers.
I read that, yes.
Yes.
Okay.
So, yeah, I'm sorry, I'll stop there.
Oh, well, no. Well, listen, Dr. Wright, we're going to begin to wind this down.
Okay.
We wanted to listen up. Thank you very much for joining us. But briefly, if you would, okay, what place do you feel Booker T. Washington occupies in our struggle? Of course, I'm quite sure some would say with him building Tuskegee University alone, that right there. But besides, what place do you think that he occupies? I understand, you refer to him as a Pan-Africanist, but I should say, what do you, pardon me if I might seem redundant, but what place do you feel he serves in our struggle? Or if you were to narrow it down, if someone were to ask you, who was Booker T. Washington, rather?
Well, I would certainly say he ends up being a Pan-Africanist. But what does he do? What is his place in our struggle? I think you can absolutely identify him as someone who, created models on how to wage struggle from within this, this country, from within this superpower that we both suffer under and built, right? He is someone who created models that we can build on today. I think the consciousness, and I get into his development, right, so that you can understand why he's even facing Africa, why everything he does, he wants to send it to Africa first, and why he is deeply connected to the African world. But I would say he is absolutely a Pan-Africanist. We can weigh and measure him as such, right? And we can weigh and measure him as such in respect to the cases that I present and in respect to his relationships. So what he gives us are models, really, that we can improve on how to challenge this country and other imperialist nations or Western nations in dealing with our people, right? Both of those cases that I present are not only evidence, but a blueprint for how we can do that. Right now, we're dealing with the immigration issue in this country, and most people are unaware of that final case in the book around the African exclusion measure, right? How the African person was systematically criminalized by U.S. immigration policy. It's Washington who opposed that and had the consciousness and the power, right, at the same time. You see, side note, Du Bois and others are opposed to the African exclusion measure. They do not have the power, constituted or unconstituted, to challenge the African exclusion measure, nor have any way of, contributing to its defeat in any real way, other than just protesting it, right? But Washington had the power and the ability to influence it. So we have to learn about how to use our power, how to use unconstituted power, how to use constituted power, and for whom. The question of whom is never unanswered with Washington. For whom? For us, for African people. He's not unclear about that. So I think he absolutely belongs in the canon of Pan-Africanists. We're struggling today around identity, right? Many of the people who would benefit from the defeat of the African exclusion measure and would be considered African and Black people by this nation do not today consider themselves Black and least of all African. right?
Yes.
That measure targeted the Caribbean, Central, and South America. Okay? All of which don't ever put the word African in front of their identities and are struggling with their understanding and relationship to blackness still.
That's right. They won't even put black. You're right.
Right.
Definitely.
They're struggling. They're going to say negro. They're not going to say black. And it's not necessarily a positive, right? Okay, so they're still struggling, yet moving towards, their first Black Power movement, to raise the consciousness. But 100 years ago, they certainly did not have that consciousness, right? Enough to answer this country's closed door policy in respect to them. And so, the demographic, the breakdown of our communities today would be quite different. Some of the people we know wouldn't even exist if, that measure wasn't defeated, because their ancestors would not have come here and made the relationships they did they made in order to produce them. So, Washington had both the consciousness and the power in 1 week. Right? He had acquired that consciousness over a lifetime, and he had acquired that power over the span of his adult life as ultimately an international figure, but really, literally, just simply a university president. This is why it's so, astounding that he was able to weigh into the situations going on throughout the African world. But in that 1 week, he not only answered, he mounts the greatest challenge to one of the most racist and anti-human immigration bills this country has ever tried to pass.
Well, listen, Dr. Wright, we thank you very much for joining us. But before we go off the air, we want you to tell our listeners where they can reach you, as well as the website, but also your social media handles.
Oh, yes.
And of course, where they can buy the book.
Yes, so you can buy the book on the website, Booker T. Washington and Africa.com. No abbreviation, just Booker T. Washington and Africa.com. You can purchase the book there. Right now, let me tell you, Amazon has a book for $70. It does not cost that. you can buy it straight from the book site, under Global Africa Press, and it's only $20. So, and I've just got on Instagram because of, all of the, contact because of the book, but you can follow me on Instagram, Dr. Wright 24. And what else? I think that's it. And if you get a chance and you're free on Thursday nights, you can catch me on the air in New York on WBAI Thursday nights 9 to 10 on Where We Live on WBAI.
Aren't you on Facebook too, Dr. Wright?
Oh, yes. You can catch me. I don't know. That might be just for friends. Yes, you can catch me on Facebook. Just Tyrene Wright. Tyrene Wright. So you can open it up to add more friends. I don't have that many more that I can add, but I will do that. And you can, but Instagram is good. I'm going to start. I have not started posting a lot of things on Instagram, but it is up, and you can follow me, and I will make sure I start posting things in Instagram this week related to the book.
Well, Dr. Wright, we thank you very much for joining us, and we would like to thank our audience for joining us as well, or our listeners. I'm Doshon Farad, and you've been listening to YourBlackWorld.com's podcast. Later, Hotep.